And I've got 20 minutes to give you the history of efforts to reduce motor vehicle crash injuries and deaths. And that's pretty easy because the first 70 years it was all crap. Everything they did for 70 years was worthless. This presentation is going to be very European, US-centric, for the obvious reason that early on, the United States was the first country to have large numbers of cars and to see the problems created by motor vehicle crashes from the very beginning. And if you look at the history in the United States, this is just fatalities from motor vehicle crashes from 1900 to 2016. You can see that except for the interruption of World War II, there was a continuing upward trend as we got more and more vehicles and more deaths, and nothing was working. And that's because, as you see at the bottom of the slide, folklore or folklore-based approaches were dominating, and it was not until around 1970 that science started to take over and develop effective countermeasures. Just so we know what we're talking about, folklore is the belief, traditional beliefs, questions, and the ideas are passed on from generation to generation by word of mouth. And nothing is ever evaluated because you know what works, just because you know. The sad thing is that almost everything that was tried didn't work. As I say, from 1910 to 1970, countermeasures were based on folklore. The focus was almost entirely on education to prevent accidents, and countermeasures that were implemented were never evaluated. And we had all kinds of early safety groups and countermeasures, starting, as far as I could tell, in 1914 with the U.S. National Safety Council. Then in 1920, the U.S. Developed what was believed to be an all-embracing approach to this problem, and it was called the 3 E's: engineering, enforcement, and education. And this was the U.S. approach for many decades. But while that may sound like it was comprehensive, the entire focus was on preventing accidents. Reducing the consequences of accidents was not considered. And in 1932, the U.S. began high school driver education, and it was proclaimed in the U.S. as the only way, there was no alternative way to produce safe beginning drivers. And then in 1936, the UK formed the National Safety First Association, and it later became the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents. And these various groups did all kinds of programs, educational programs. One was in the UK, the Tufty Club. Apparently an employee of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents was having lunch when she saw a squirrel hop onto the curb, look around for traffic, and then hop across the road. For some reason, this was the inspiration for Tufty and the Tufty clubs. And the clubs proved, and I've underlined, very successful, with literally thousands being started throughout the UK. But success had nothing to do with effectiveness. Success was just that lots of people, for some crazy reason, wanted to belong to a Tufty club. This is the sort of thing, I'm not showing the animated version of this, but here we see Bobby Tufty and Mrs. Fluffytail teaching young children how to cross the road. It's all part of this, we will educate, and we will educate, and we will never evaluate. In the US, we were just as bad. What we like to do in the United States was put up lots of posters. So you'd be going around the United States and you'd see posters saying, be safe, drive smart, whatever that means. Or don't jaywalk. But this is what was done. In the UK, in 1971,
Well,
there was a major campaign called Clunk Click to encourage people to wear belts, focused on Jimmy Savile, later shown to be a major pedophile.
not for 30 years later.
Yeah, 30 years later, was discovered to be a major pedophile, but no, certainly a major pedophile. And as far as I can tell, even though this campaign ran on TV in the UK for many years, I could not find any evidence anywhere that anybody attempted to go out and look at seatbelt wearing to see if it changed behavior. And I'm betting that it didn't. But during this period in the United States, this early period, there were a few individuals, and they were mainly in the United States, but not entirely, that wanted a broader approach to the problem. Early on, there was Dr. Claire Straith, Dr. Fletcher Woodward, and Hugh DeHaven, who did a lot of work on injuries caused by car designs and pushed for safety belts with little success. The only non-US person I could find in this early history was Hugh Cairns, who was an MD who treated Lawrence of Arabia when he came off of his motorcycle and had head injuries that turned out to be fatal. And Hugh Cairns promoted early motorcycle helmets and actually got the British military motorcycle dispatch riders to wear helmets. And so there was some beginnings. Red Lombard was a professor in California, developed the first really effective motorcycle helmet. Colonel John Stapp, many of you attended Stapp car crash conferences. John Stapp's early claim to fame was that he rode a rocket sled to over 600 miles an hour and was decelerated to zero in a very short space of time. And then a key person who I worked for many, many years, Dr. William Haddon, developed the framework, or a first framework for a comprehensive set of countermeasures. Many of you, I think, are familiar with the Haddon matrix that he developed. And last but not least was Ralph Nader, who was a lawyer but became a very effective advocate for doing something about car designs because General Motors rather foolishly put private detectives on him and had him followed for weeks and weeks and weeks. And ultimately, General Motors had to apologize in public for doing that to Ralph Nader. One of their claims for doing it was that anybody who was criticizing U.S. car manufacturers was probably a communist, and they needed to find his communist affiliations. But these individuals did have some influence, not a great deal, but for example, Dr. Claire Straith, one of the early advocates, got Walter Chrysler, who was the founder of the Chrysler Motor Company, to add some features such as recessed knobs on their 1937 models. I don't know if you can see all that language up there. I can't highlight it from my angle here, I don't think, but no. But they were advertising recessed knobs in the safety interiors of their cars in 1937. Still didn't have seat belts or safety belts, but they did have, quote, safety interiors. Here's John Stapp. As I say, he was in a rocket sled accelerated to 632 miles an hour or 1,011 kilometers per hour. And then he was decelerated, and he withstood in one of his runs 46.2 Gs in a forward position without serious injury. But he did get some injuries. He got detached retinas and various other things. And then the big change occurred in the mid-1960s, when there were hearings on vehicle safety in the US Congress, prompted in large part by General Motors' foolish decision to put a private detective on Ralph Nader. He testified, as did others, and this led to two very key pieces of legislation. The US National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966, which authorized the US federal government for the first time ever to set national standards for vehicles. Prior to that, vehicle regulations were at the state level in the US, and this was the first time that the US federal government was able to regulate vehicles because motor vehicles were in interstate commerce, and that allowed the federal government to intervene. There was also the US Highway Safety Act of 1966, which also tried to get the federal government involved in issues related to driver behavior. Driver behavior issues in the United States still are a state prerogative by and large, but the US Highway Safety Act of 1966 authorized the federal government to issue safety standards for driver-related issues, including a standard that was issued that said all states shall have a motorcycle helmet law, and if they didn't, they would lose federal highway construction funds. And in fact, by the early 1970s, we had 48 states with motorcycle helmet laws applying to all motorcycle riders. Unfortunately, that led to opposition, and the authority under the Highway Safety Act to withhold construction funds was withdrawn. On the right, you see Dr. William Haddon, who was the first head of the National Highway Safety Bureau, which later became the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA. And in 1967, Bill Haddon and one engineer wrote the first federal motor vehicle safety standards. The big advance there, compared with the past, was that these standards addressed how vehicles should perform in crashes, and specifically at the time how they should perform in 30-mile-an-hour crashes into a rigid barrier. Some years later, in 1978, Joan Claybrook, who was then I think she was the third or fourth NHTSA administrator. Haddon was never NHTSA administrator because by the time Haddon left, it was still the National Highway Safety Bureau. She introduced the idea of running crash tests at 35 miles an hour and measuring how the cars performed above the minimum standards that were specified at 30 and publicizing the results. This was the new car assessment program, and it has become, around the world, one of the most effective ways to promote vehicle safety improvements. For a long time, it was promoting improvements in crashworthiness. More recently, it's also promoting improvements in advanced crash avoidance. Bill Haddon left the federal government when the Nixon administration came into office because it's a political appointment. And he was recruited by the insurance industry to take over the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, which had existed for 10 years, but basically, as Nader described it, it was part of the safety establishment. When Ralph Nader was writing his book Unsafe at Any Speed, he called the communications director of IIHS and said, "What does the insurance industry do to promote safer cars?" And the response was, "We don't tell them how to sell cars and how to make cars, and they don't tell us how to sell insurance." But Haddon was brought in 1969 to change things at the Institute, transform it into a research organization. I joined 7 months later, and the first best year and a half hadn't had to clean up the crap that the IIHS had been funding prior to his arrival. And here's one of the things that IIHS had been promoting or funding. This was a safety poster put up by the Texas Safety Council, and they spent $1 million on posters all over Texas, like this one saying "Drive Friendly." One of my early tasks with Bill was to explain to the sponsors why this sort of nonsense had to stop. And of course, not everybody was a big fan of these kinds of posters. Here's something where somebody says that my dog can drive better than you people in Texas. But we got lots of countermeasures early on, and I should say these concepts spread outside of the United States. UN regulations, European regulations, adopted Australian regulations, adopted very similar countermeasures, particularly a lot of these new crashworthiness improvements. Because although there were standards for crash avoidance, lights, turn signals, brakes, etc., those early standards did not advance the technology. And so we started to see very big differences in car designs, and this was crashworthiness designs, and this was accelerated substantially when NCAPs started, first with the US NHTSA NCAP. IIHS started an NCAP in 1995, and I often run into people in my age group, because I'm getting up there now, say, well, they don't make cars like they used to. And the answer to that is, thank God they don't make cars like they used to. Because a few years ago, IIHS did a crash test, 40 mile an hour, each vehicle going 40 miles an hour, into each other in an offset crash. And one vehicle is a 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air, a very iconic old car, and the other is a 2009 comparable size Chevrolet model. The Bel Air weighs 500 pounds more than the new model, and here's the result of old versus new. Occupant compartments routinely collapsed in these kinds of crashes prior to the push to improve them. You can see, of course, there wasn't even a seatbelt in the 59 Bel Air. When the Institute started 40 mile an hour, 64 kilometer per hour frontal offset crashes, not into another car, but into a deformable barrier, compartment collapse was routine. Now, in our markets, there's no collapse of the compartment in this crash. The compartments remain perfectly intact, which means that the restraint systems can then do their job and protect. If the compartment collapses, it doesn't matter whether or not the restraint systems are there. Some years ago, NHTSA evaluated how many lives, they estimated how many lives were saved by vehicle technology starting back in the 60s, and they estimated that in that period 613,000 lives have been saved by vehicle safety improvements. So I'm going to hop through. Now we have a lot of crash avoidance improvements coming into cars. These features promise a lot more improvements. In the US, 20 automakers have agreed to make Automatic emergency braking, for example, is a standard feature in all new US models by September 22. And this year, every single Toyota model, from the least expensive up to their Lexus models, will have AEB, a standard equipment. Clearly, we're going to get a lot more advanced crash avoidance. We also have safety laws that work, traffic engineering designs that work. We also were able to go back and evaluate some of the early approaches and find that high school driver education didn't work, made things worse. Advanced skid pad training made things worse. Drivers with great skill levels don't have fewer crashes on the highway than average drivers, and motorcycle training courses don't work. There are some negatives. Safety does not overcome everything. In the United States, we've gone from a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, which was introduced to save fuel, back to a range of speed limits. That's resulted in many deaths. Similarly, and I don't know if this is true in Europe, but in the US we have a strong relationship with unemployment and vehicle crashes. So when unemployment goes down, crashes and fatalities go up. But here we are, back to the first slide. You can see that we've made progress since 1970 in the United States, and you'll see in a paper by Cavi Bali later today this same shape curve for many countries. So we are reaping the benefits of science, although as I note here, there is some folklore that still continues. And that's a quick history
Thank
of
you.
highway safety.